Breaking case is playing out in federal court this week as a mother from the Red Lake Nation is on trial, charged with murdering two of her children. Her attorney is using an insanity defense. KARE 11's Lou Ragoose has the latest from court.
The first news of the incident came in March 2024 in the form of a statewide Amber Alert.
They are looking for the woman on the right-hand side of your screen, Jennifer Stately, in connection to the case.
Jennifer Stately, traveling with her malnourished and abused 3-year-old son, was soon after captured. Then, the even darker details of the rest of her alleged crimes.
Federal prosecutors say Jennifer Stately stabbed two children last month, killing one, then setting their home on fire, which killed the other.
According to the federal indictment, Stately willfully and maliciously set fire to the home in the Red Lake Indian Reservation in northern Minnesota. Her attorney, Paul Eng, however, argues she thought the home was demonic. He's using the insanity defense in the emotional trial playing out at the Minneapolis federal courthouse. Red Lake is a sovereign nation, and serious felony crimes are handled in federal court. The jury is hearing about 6-year-old Remy, described in his obituary as a smart, funny, loving little boy who loved to play with his brothers. 5-year-old Tristan's obituary says he was an outgoing, spirited little boy who was the protector of his brothers, even though he was in the middle. Jurors will hear more about the insanity defense when Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Crocker finishes her case. Crocker says Stately has never been diagnosed with psychosis. Now, much of today's testimony came from the investigators in the case, laying out the evidence that they found. Testimony resumes on Tuesday, and then on Thursday, we're expected to hear the defense testimony regarding that insanity claim. Julie.
Oh, it's such a sad case. I don't know if you know the answer to this, Lou, but do you know what happened to the little boy who was with her?
Yes, he is being cared for by her mother and the boy's father, mostly her mother, though, the grandmother.
Oh, it's a heartbreaking case.
Yep.
Thank you, Lou.
The fire was already eating through the walls by the time anyone realized something was wrong. It was just after dark on March 15, 2024, when flames began tearing through a quiet home on the Red Lake Nation Reservation in northern Minnesota. Neighbors would later say they heard nothing unusual at first. No prolonged screaming, no frantic pounding on doors, just the sudden glow of orange cutting through the night. Inside that burning house were two young boys. Would by the time first responders arrived, the structure was engulfed. Smoke rolled into the cold air as firefighters forced their way in. What they found inside would send shockwaves through an entire community and launch a federal investigation that would take nearly 2 years to bring to trial. But the most disturbing part wasn't just the fire. It was who investigators say started it. Earlier that evening, 37-year-old Jennifer Marie Stately had been alone with her children. But what happened inside that house in the hours before the flames erupted would later be reconstructed piece by piece in a federal courtroom. Prosecutors would argue that the fire was not an accident. It was not reckless behavior. It was deliberate. 3 separate ignition points, gasoline, lighter fluid, fires set at both exits of the home. And before the flames ever sparked, there had already been violence. When investigators examined the scene, they uncovered evidence of a brutal attack. But one child had suffered fatal sharp force injuries. The other, trapped as smoke thickened and oxygen disappeared, died from carbon monoxide poisoning. By the time authorities pieced this together, Jennifer Stately was no longer at the scene. She had fled. An Amber Alert was issued across Minnesota. Patrol units scanned highways. Dispatchers relayed vehicle descriptions. Less than an hour later, a motorist spotted her nearly 150 miles away in Todd County. State patrol officers and local deputies moved in. She was taken into custody and booked into jail as the investigation widened. Because the crime occurred on tribal land, federal jurisdiction applied. The FBI stepped in. A TF-certified fire investigators analyzed burn patterns and accelerants. Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension technicians processed the scene. What they concluded would form the backbone of the prosecution's case. This was not chaos, it was premeditation. Nearly 2 years later, after a 2.5-week trial before Judge John R. Tunheim in Minneapolis, Jurors heard the full reconstruction. They saw forensic reports. They listened to expert testimony on fire science. They examined medical findings. And they heard the defense argue that Stately was legally insane at the time of the killings. The jury deliberated. Then they rejected the insanity defense. Jennifer Marie Stately was found guilty on all 6 counts. 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, 2 counts of murder during the commission of child abuse, 1 count of murder during the commission of arson, and 1 count of arson. Federal and tribal officials called the case devastating, unthinkable, horrific. But for the Red Lake community, the legal outcome was only part of the story. Because long after the courtroom emptied and the verdict was read, the questions remained. About motive, about mental health, about what could possibly lead to a night like March 15th. And about the 2 young lives that never had a chance to escape the smoke. We can now move into a deeper chronological reconstruction of the night, or build tension by rewinding to the hours before the fire. Long before the jury ever saw photographs of the charred living room, before accelerant patterns were diagrammed on courtroom screens, day before federal prosecutors laid out their theory of premeditation, there was a quiet house on the Red Lake Nation reservation where 3 children lived with their mother. On March 15, 2024, the day did not begin with sirens. It did not begin with smoke. It began like countless other days in northern Minnesota, cold air hanging low over the trees, patches of snow still clinging to shaded ground, the late winter sky pale and distant. For the Red Lake community, life moved at its usual rhythm. School buses ran their routes. Neighbors drove past one another on familiar roads. Nothing about that Friday signaled what would unfold by nightfall. Inside the home, 37-year-old Jennifer Marie Stately was alone with her children. What investigators would later reconstruct in painstaking detail was not based on eyewitnesses inside the house, because there were none. It was based on physical evidence, forensic science, burn patterns, medical reports, timelines, and the digital and mechanical footprints left behind after she drove away. According to trial testimony, at some point during the evening hours, violence began inside that house. The prosecution would later tell jurors that Stately assaulted her sons, inflicting numerous injuries. Evidence presented at trial indicated that a knife was used. One child suffered fatal sharp force injuries. The other would later die from carbon monoxide poisoning as smoke filled the home. And these conclusions did not emerge overnight. They came from autopsies conducted by medical examiners, from wound analysis, from toxicology reports, and from the scientific reconstruction of the scene. But before the fire, there was movement inside the house, struggle, chaos. No neighbors reported hearing extended screaming. No frantic calls for help were placed from inside the home. The isolation of the setting, common in rural reservation communities, meant that events inside could unfold without immediate detection. After the physical assaults, prosecutors argued, Stately turned to fire. A TF-certified fire investigators later testified that 3 separate ignition points were identified. Gasoline and lighter fluid were used as accelerants. Fires were intentionally set, including at both exit points of the house. That detail would become central to the prosecution's theory that escape routes were deliberately blocked. In fire science, burn patterns tell a story. Investigators examine depth of char, pour patterns, ventilation effects, and the way flames travel when accelerants are present. According to testimony during the 2.5-week trial, the evidence was consistent with deliberate ignition rather than accidental spread. The older child died from sharp force injuries before the fire consumed the structure. The younger child, unable to escape the thickening smoke, died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide is odorless, invisible. It replaces oxygen in the bloodstream. Victims often lose consciousness before they can fully comprehend what is happening. By the time flames began breaking through windows, the events inside had already sealed the outcome. At some point after igniting the fires, or Stately left the home. She did not stay to watch it burn. She drove away. When emergency calls finally came in, reporting the blaze, first responders arrived to find a structure already heavily involved. Firefighters battled the flames while law enforcement secured the perimeter. As suppression efforts continued, responders made the grim discovery inside. Almost immediately, the focus shifted from fire response to criminal investigation. Because the home was located on tribal land within the Red Lake Nation, federal jurisdiction applied. Under U.S. law, certain serious crimes committed in Indian country fall under federal authority. That meant the FBI would lead the investigation, working alongside tribal and state partners. But before the full scope of the crime was known, there was a missing person. Jennifer Stately was not at the scene. Authorities quickly determined she had left the residence. An Amber Alert was issued. The description of her vehicle was broadcast. Law enforcement agencies across the region were notified. Patrol officers scanned highways, rural roads, and gas stations. Less than an hour after the alert went out, a motorist in Todd County, approximately 150 miles south of Red Lake, spotted a vehicle matching the description. The tip was relayed to authorities. Minnesota State Patrol, the Todd County Sheriff's Department, and Long Prairie Police Department converged on the area. She was located. She was taken into custody without a reported high-speed chase or standoff. She was booked into the Todd County Jail. That arrest, swift as it was, marked only the beginning of what would become a complex federal case. Back in Red Lake, investigators began processing what remained of the home. Fire scenes are delicate environments. Water damage, structural collapse, and extreme heat can destroy evidence. TF fire investigators worked to preserve and analyze what they could. Burn patterns were mapped. Samples were collected for laboratory analysis to confirm the presence of gasoline and lighter fluid. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension assisted with crime scene processing. Photographs were taken, items were catalogued. Every detail mattered because in a courtroom months later, each piece would need to withstand cross-examination. Medical examiners conducted autopsies. They documented injuries, cause of death, toxicology results. These findings would form the foundation of the homicide charges. As the investigation progressed, federal prosecutors evaluated potential charges. Ultimately, a grand jury returned an indictment charging Jennifer Marie Stately with 6 counts. 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, 2 counts of murder during the commission of child abuse, 1 count of murder during the commission of arson, and 1 count of arson. A first-degree premeditated murder under federal law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the killing was intentional and planned. Murder during the commission of another felony, in this case child abuse or arson, carries its own legal weight. The arson charge addressed the deliberate ignition of the structure itself. The case moved toward trial. Over the following months, defense attorneys prepared an affirmative defense. Insanity. Under federal law, the insanity defense requires proving that at the time of the offense the defendant suffered from a severe mental disease or defect and was unable to appreciate the nature and quality or the wrongfulness of her acts. It is a high bar. The burden rests on the defense. When the trial began in Minneapolis before the Honorable Judge John R. Thunheim, the courtroom filled with prosecutors, defense counsel, federal agents, tribal representatives, and family members. For 2.5 weeks, jurors listened. They heard from ATF fire experts explaining how accelerants change flame behavior. They saw diagrams illustrating ignition points. They heard medical testimony detailing the injuries. They were presented with the timeline from the evening inside the house to the Amber Alert and arrest in Todd County. The defense presented its own witnesses, including mental health experts who argued that Stately was legally insane at the time of the killings, and the prosecution countered with evidence. The prosecution countered with evidence suggesting deliberate planning, multiple ignition points, accelerants brought and used, exit routes blocked. In a trial like this, jurors are asked to do something extraordinary. They must step into the reconstruction of a night they did not witness and determine intent. They must evaluate scientific testimony and psychological analysis. They must decide whether actions were the product of calculated decision-making or severe mental illness. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated. When they returned, the verdict was unequivocal: guilty on all 6 counts. The insanity defense was rejected. For the Red Lake Nation community, the verdict brought a measure of legal resolution. Officials from the FBI, ATF, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and the Red Lake Department of Public Safety issued statements acknowledging the devastation and expressing commitment to justice. But outside the courtroom, grief does not follow legal procedure. Communities like Red Lake are tightly connected. News spreads quickly. Loss reverberates. The impact of a crime like this is not confined to one household. It touches extended family networks, schools, neighbors, tribal leadership. The fire that consumed that house did more than destroy a structure. It exposed a sequence of events that prosecutors argued was deliberate, calculated, and fatal. It triggered a federal investigation involving multiple agencies. It led to a courtroom battle over sanity and intent, and it left 2 young lives at the center of a case that would be remembered long after headlines faded. When the courtroom doors closed each morning in Minneapolis, the noise of the outside world faded. What remained inside was clinical, methodical, or almost sterile. A stark contrast to the violence at the center of the case. The prosecution did not begin with emotion. They began with structure. Jurors were told they would see evidence in layers. First, the physical reconstruction of the scene, then the medical findings, and finally, the psychological battle that would determine whether Jennifer Marie Stately understood what she was doing on March 15, 2024. The government's case relied heavily on science. ATF certified fire investigators were among the first key witnesses. They explained to the jury that accidental house fires follow patterns. Electrical malfunctions have signatures. Kitchen fires leave predictable damage paths. But this scene did not follow those patterns. 3 separate ignition points were identified inside the residence. That detail mattered. In fire investigation, multiple ignition points often indicate human intervention. The experts walked jurors through burn pattern analysis, how accelerants create irregular char patterns and rapid flame spread. Laboratory testing confirmed the presence of gasoline and lighter fluid. These were not incidental household vapors. They were introduced. Then came one of the most critical pieces of testimony. Fires were set at both exit points of the home. Blocking exits is not a random act. Prosecutors did not need to speculate about motive at that moment. They simply presented the physical facts. Flames were deliberately ignited near the doors. The jury was left to draw its own inference about what that meant for anyone inside. Medical examiners followed. Autopsy findings were presented carefully, without theatrics. The older child suffered fatal sharp force injuries. The wounds were consistent with a knife. The medical examiner testified that the injuries alone were sufficient to cause death. The younger child's cause of death was different: carbon monoxide poisoning. The expert explained how smoke inhalation affects the body. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin in the blood more effectively than oxygen. As levels rise, victims experience confusion, weakness, unconsciousness. Eventually, the heart stops. The timeline mattered here. Toxicology results indicated that the younger child was alive when the fire was burning. That meant the fire was not merely an attempt to conceal a prior death. It was part of the chain of causation, which the prosecution emphasized: sequence, assault, fatal stabbing, ignition of multiple fires, blocked exits, death from smoke. Each step built toward premeditation. Then came the digital evidence. Phone records were introduced. Location data placed Stately's vehicle traveling south away from Red Lake shortly after the estimated time of ignition. Surveillance cameras along highways confirmed movement consistent with the timeline established by investigators. When the Amber Alert was issued, but law enforcement already suspected that she had left intentionally. Less than an hour later, a motorist's tip confirmed it. Officers who participated in the arrest testified. They described the traffic stop in Todd County. There was no dramatic standoff, no attempt to flee at high speed once spotted. She was taken into custody and transported to jail. Prosecutors were deliberate about this portion of testimony. They did not portray hysteria. They portrayed departure. Departure suggests awareness. Throughout the government's case, Assistant U.S. Attorneys Rachel L. Craker and Garrett S. Fields returned repeatedly to one concept: choice. Choice to assault, choice to retrieve accelerants, choice to ignite multiple fires, choice to leave. But the defense had been preparing its response long before trial began. The insanity defense is not a claim of temporary sadness or stress. Under federal law, it requires proof of a severe mental disease or defect that rendered the defendant unable to appreciate the nature and quality or wrongfulness of her acts. That is an extraordinarily high legal standard. The defense called mental health experts who had evaluated Stately. They testified about her psychological history, they described symptoms, they discussed diagnostic criteria. Jurors heard terms like psychosis, severe mental disorder, cognitive impairment. One of the defense's arguments centered on perception. If a person cannot understand reality, cannot comprehend the consequences or moral weight of actions, then intent becomes legally complicated. One expert described episodes in which Stately's thinking may have been distorted. Another discussed how severe mental illness can impair judgment. The defense was not disputing that the acts occurred. They were disputing culpability. Cross-examination became the battlefield. Prosecutors pressed the experts. Did she understand how to drive 150 miles south? Did she understand how to obtain gasoline and lighter fluid? Did she understand how to avoid immediate detection by leaving the scene? These were not emotional questions, they were functional ones. Function implies cognition. Cognition implies awareness. The prosecution also highlighted the methodical aspects of the fire. Accelerants do not ignite themselves. Multiple ignition points require movement from one location to another. Blocking exits requires spatial understanding. During closing arguments, the government framed the case as one of planning and execution. They told jurors that insanity does not explain organized action. They emphasized the sequence: assault, fire, flight. The defense, in turn, urged jurors to consider the unseen, the internal state of mind at the time. They reminded the jury that mental illness is not always visible, but that someone can perform outwardly organized actions while experiencing severe psychological distortion. The courtroom atmosphere shifted as the trial neared its end. Family members sat quietly in the gallery. Tribal leaders attended proceedings. Federal agents who had worked the case watched as their months of investigation were distilled into arguments and jury instructions. Judge John R. Tunheim provided detailed legal guidance to the jurors before deliberation, as he explained the elements required for first-degree premeditated murder. He outlined the legal standard for insanity. He reminded them that the burden for the insanity defense rested with the defense. Then the jury left the courtroom. Deliberations are private, no cameras, no transcripts. just 12 individuals weighing evidence that spanned weeks. But they had to decide not only whether the acts occurred, that was largely undisputed, but whether they were carried out with premeditation and whether Stately was legally insane at the time. When the jury returned, there was no visible hesitation. Guilty on all 6 counts. 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. 2 counts of murder during the commission of child abuse. 1 count of murder during the commission of arson. 1 count of arson. The insanity defense was rejected. In federal court, a guilty verdict on first-degree premeditated murder carries severe consequences. Sentencing would come later, but the verdict itself marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another: accountability. Outside the courthouse, statements were issued by law enforcement leaders. The FBI acknowledged its partnership with tribal, state, and federal agencies. TF officials emphasized the role of fire science in securing the conviction. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension highlighted the coordination that led to the apprehension. Red Lake Department of Public Safety officials spoke of community grief and commitment to justice. But inside the legal record, the most significant outcome was simpler. The jury found that Jennifer Marie Stately acted with premeditation and was legally sane. The fire scene told one story, of accelerants and ignition points. The autopsies told another, of sharp force injuries and toxicology levels. The courtroom told a third, of intent, mental state, and legal standards. Yet even after a unanimous verdict, certain questions linger. What was happening in the days and weeks before March 15th? Were there warning signs? Did anyone see behavioral shifts? How does a community process a crime committed within its own boundaries? When the verdict was read, the courtroom did not erupt. There were no dramatic outbursts, or no raised voices, just the steady cadence of the clerk's voice repeating the word guilty, count after count, until all 6 had been confirmed. For many watching, the legal outcome had been anticipated. The evidence presented over 2.5 weeks was detailed, technical, and structured. But anticipation does not soften impact. In cases like this, a verdict does not feel like triumph. It feels like confirmation. Confirmation that what happened cannot be undone. Outside the federal courthouse in Minneapolis, officials delivered statements carefully crafted to reflect both accountability and grief. Representatives from the FBI, ATF, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and the Red Lake Department of Public Safety emphasized cooperation. They spoke of tireless investigative work, of scientific analysis, of partnership across federal, state, and tribal lines. But within the Red Lake Nation community itself, the reaction was more complex. Red Lake is not an anonymous suburb. It is a sovereign tribal nation with deep kinship networks. Families are interconnected. Loss does not remain isolated to a single household. It ripples outward, through relatives, through classmates, through community members who may not have known the victims personally, but feel the weight of proximity. When a crime occurs within a small, tightly bound community, it fractures trust in ways that extend beyond the courtroom. But the idea that harm came from inside the home, from a parent, challenges the most basic assumptions of safety. Legal accountability provides structure. It does not provide healing. Because the crimes occurred on tribal land, federal jurisdiction governed the prosecution. Under the Major Crimes Act, certain serious offenses committed in Indian country fall under federal authority. That means cases like this are tried in federal court rather than tribal court, often hundreds of miles away from the community where the events occurred. For some community members, that distance can feel both protective and disorienting. Protective, because federal resources bring forensic expertise and prosecutorial capacity. disorienting because the legal proceedings unfold outside the immediate tribal environment. Throughout the investigation and trial, coordination between agencies was essential. The FBI led the federal investigation. Key ATF fire investigators reconstructed the ignition patterns. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension processed evidence. Local and tribal law enforcement handled immediate response and arrest coordination. Todd County authorities assisted in apprehension. Each agency brought a specific role. Cases involving fire require specialized analysis. Fire is destructive by nature. It consumes the very evidence investigators need to interpret. That the prosecution was able to identify accelerants, determine ignition points, and establish sequence reflects the precision of modern fire science. But beyond the forensic achievements lies a more difficult question: prevention. In the weeks following the verdict, conversations in Red Lake and surrounding communities shifted toward mental health resources, support systems, and warning signs. While the jury rejected the insanity defense, the presence of that defense during trial ensured that mental health was part of the public discussion. Nor the insanity defense is frequently misunderstood. It does not mean a defendant denies committing the act. It asserts that due to severe mental disease or defect, the defendant could not appreciate the nature or wrongfulness of the conduct. In federal court, the burden of proving insanity rests with the defense. It must be established by clear and convincing evidence. In this case, the jury concluded that standard was not met. But the broader issue of mental health remains relevant in communities across the country. Rural areas, including tribal nations, often face limited access to psychiatric services, crisis intervention resources, and long-term treatment facilities. These systemic realities do not excuse criminal conduct, but they do inform broader policy conversations. As sentencing approached, attention turned to consequences. While federal first-degree premeditated murder carries the possibility of life imprisonment. The sentencing phase would consider statutory guidelines, aggravating factors, and victim impact statements. In federal court, sentencing is determined by a judge, guided by the United States sentencing guidelines and statutory mandates. Victim impact statements are often among the most powerful moments in a case. They allow family members to articulate loss in their own words. In crimes involving children, those statements carry a particular weight. They are not arguments about legal standards. They are reflections of absence. Birthdays that will not be celebrated, milestones that will never occur. For the Red Lake community, the legal process may have concluded with conviction, but the emotional process does not operate on a judicial timeline. The house itself is gone. Fire reduces wood and drywall to ash and twisted framing. Insurance, demolition, and rebuilding are logistical matters. But no reconstruction replaces what occurred inside those walls. In interviews following the trial, law enforcement officials emphasized partnership and justice. They used words like closure, accountability, commitment. These terms serve a purpose. They acknowledge that the system functioned as designed: evidence gathered, charges filed, trial conducted, verdict rendered. Yet closure is a complicated concept. Closure suggests a definitive ending. In reality, as cases like this mark a transition rather than a conclusion. The legal chapter ends, the community chapter continues. For tribal nations, sovereignty intersects with federal authority in unique ways. Crimes prosecuted federally may feel removed from tribal legal structures, yet the impact remains local. That duality is part of the modern legal landscape in Indian country. In Minneapolis, court records will preserve the details of United States versus Jennifer Marie Stately. Transcripts will catalogue expert testimony on burn patterns and toxicology. Appellate rights may be exercised, motions may be filed, legal proceedings continue within procedural frameworks. But in Red Lake, memory functions differently. It resides in community gatherings, in quiet conversations, in the shared understanding that something unthinkable occurred within familiar boundaries. The agencies involved described the children as victims who had no chance at survival while in the care of the person responsible for protecting them. That phrase, no chance at survival, echoes beyond the courtroom. It reflects the prosecution's theory of blocked exits and accelerants. It reflects the medical findings. It reflects the jury's conclusion. And it underscores why the case resonated so deeply. True crime narratives often focus on the moment of violence or the drama of arrest. But the more enduring impact lies in aftermath. Aftermath includes policy discussions about emergency alerts and response times. It includes mental health outreach efforts. It includes law enforcement training refinements. It includes community healing initiatives. It also includes silence. There are moments when communities choose not to relive details publicly, when they protect memory by limiting repetition, when they prioritize forward movement over public examination. And for viewers watching this story unfold through documentary narration, it may feel structured, beginning, middle, end. In reality, it is layered. Layered with forensic science. Layered with legal argument. Layered with psychological evaluation. Layered with grief. The verdict established criminal responsibility. It affirmed that the acts were premeditated and that legal insanity was not proven. It did not answer every emotional question. Why that night? Why those children? And why that sequence of decisions? The criminal justice system is designed to answer specific questions. Did the defendant commit the acts? Were they intentional? Do they meet statutory definitions of the charged offences? It answered those. Beyond that, interpretation belongs to families, communities, and history. What remains is not spectacle, but record. A record of a fire intentionally set. A record of 2 deaths. One from sharp force injuries, one from carbon monoxide poisoning. A record of an Amber Alert issued and a suspect located 150 miles away. A record of 6 convictions. And a record of a community that must carry forward after one of its darkest nights. The flames have long been extinguished, the courtroom lights have dimmed, but the memory of March 15th, 2024 will remain part of Red Lake's story, not as a headline, but as a chapter in its history that will not be forgotten. If you believe stories like this matter, make sure you're subscribed. We cover real cases with facts, not rumors, and we follow them all the way through the courtroom. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think the verdict brought full justice? Or are there questions that still remain? Leave your thoughts below and keep the conversation respectful.